The award-winning rapper, poet, founder of the hip-hop Shakespeare company, Akala.
So here we have it, Akala, the mixed race racist. Before we go through this, I'd strongly recommend all of you to go and watch the video linked in the description from Voltaire's Ghost on Akala's racism. It goes through it and explains it and debunks his multiple nonsensical, historically illiterate or historically semi-illiterate claims, and essentially his neo-Marxist rantings on a program he did with Frankie Boyle. So go and watch that video if you haven't already seen it, and I'm going to go through something from a recent appearance, well, two recent appearances from Akala. First one is Question Time, and then the second one is a BBC interview he did on BBC Breakfast. So without any further ado, let's get into the racism and the neo-Marxism of Akala, who is half white but for some reason describes himself and identifies as a black man. He has a white Scottish mother and a black Caribbean father.
You may remember, or you may not remember, a few years ago, I think it was 2014, but don't hold me to that. Gallup, which is an American polling company, did a global survey, 66 countries, over 100,000 people. So this was not just radical, crazy leftists. And they asked people, which country in the world is the greatest danger to world peace? This was before Trump came into office. 25%, 24% to be precise, responded the United States of America. Yeah? So if people already thought America was the greatest threat to world peace, which by inference means we're part of the threat to world peace.
Sorry, 24%.
24%, but it was the #1 country. How much worse has that got for the people around the world now? This was when Obama was leader. So I think the whole question has to be, and it's disgraceful that we don't have more challenge from anyone in our political establishment, bar a couple of radical, crazy leftist people, whether there's any challenge to the role of America's world as the global policeman. Because most of the world do not accept that. And if we're saying we believe in democracy, why are we not supporting international democracy?
So there's quite a lot of neo-Marxist rantings and neo-Marxist talking points covered there. Now, for someone that's perhaps uneducated or not that educated, and someone that's not that intelligent or clued up on such things regarding world politics and social and economic models such as Marxism or neo-Marxism, as I'm referring to here, all of this can sound somewhat convincing. It can sound somewhat true. It can sound somewhat intelligent, somewhat articulate. Now, Akala isn't an idiot. He's not a dumb person, but he is what I would call an educated fool. Someone that's indoctrinated. Someone that isn't a clear or critical or particularly rational thinker. Essentially, he's been indoctrinated by leftist-dominated academia, which is why he's pretty much parroting and echoing verbatim their talking points and their arguments and their techniques. This isn't anything original. It isn't anything that he's come up with. It's stuff that he's been taught and that he's heard, and essentially he's parroting. And if you get someone who's somewhat presentable, somewhat articulate, and they're delivering this sort of message, without a doubt, as he is here, he is given regular platforms on mainstream television, because the mainstream media has this left/far left/neo-Marxist leaning. They like all this stuff, they agree with it. So it's normal and obvious that he would be invited on shows like Question Time to spew essentially what is propaganda. So it's always helpful, and I want to also steelman him as well. I don't want to misrepresent him, but we've got this, the regressive agenda, which is from Atheism is Unstoppable, Devin Tracy. Now this pretty much covers everything that he's going to go through. I mean, this could also be called the neo-Marxist agenda, because that's pretty much what it is. A regressive is a neo-Marxist for all intents and purposes. Regressive is someone far left leaning, who sort of echoes the far leftist orthodoxies, and some of them are covered and described on this agenda. So when you're dealing with someone of that political persuasion, this is pretty much their worldview / arguments / talking points. They view the world through the Marxist lens of the oppressor versus the oppressed. So how does that manifest itself? Well, it manifests itself in the regressive agenda. So in that little segment from Akala, he's covered a few of the talking points. White people are racists, he's covered that. And number 2, blame America and its military. Fuck America. So he's already covered 2 of those. He's also covered number 5, fuck conservatives and Republicans. Fuck Trump, essentially. A quick aside, the funny thing about Trump, to me, as an outside observer, I'm not an American, I'm not a Republican, is the fact that he isn't a Republican. He's barely a conservative. In many ways, I wouldn't even describe Trump as right-wing particularly. So it's quite ironic to me that someone who isn't a conservative or a Republican is the representative of the Republican Party, essentially the leader of the Republicans, who is now the elected president of the United States as a Republican. So when you're dealing with someone like Akala, just have this agenda in mind, because these people, the goal and aim of everything they say is to cover these talking points. They want to tick off these talking points, even when they're not relevant, and Akala's done that. So always a good point of reference when you're dealing with someone of a political persuasion like Akala has. And you can also, as a mental note, just add the far leftist orthodoxies onto this. So diversity is our strength. Only whites can be racist, which is of course taken from intersectionality, which is a branch of neo-Marxism. Afrocentrism is another form of that. And of course, Akala is an Afrocentrist. Open borders, hope, not hate. Islam is a religion of peace. Britain and white Western nations are colonialists and imperialists and essentially evil. Women are oppressed. Non-whites are oppressed by the white man. Any and all of these orthodoxies, they're at the forefront of Akala's mind and his worldview. And every argument he makes, pretty much, is on the basis of those.
Certainly one of the poorest wards in the country, yeah? Traditional working class town. I'm saying, why have you picked what is the criteria by which you've picked your traditional working class town? I'd like to know. When was Hackney rich? When was Tottenham rich? When was Moss Side rich?
All right, you made the point.
So there he's just getting at the claim, the unsubstantiated claim, that these areas are somehow oppressed and downtrodden, and also that they're racist. Those areas he's referenced are large or have a significant minority population. Now, the basis of Akala's claims and argument there is that these places aren't the best areas in their prospective cities because they've got black and brown people in them. And because they've got black and brown people in them, those black and brown people are the victims of racist, institutional and systemic racism, which doesn't give money to these areas, chooses to keep them poorly performing, chooses to keep them oppressed. Again, this is all oppressor versus oppressed dichotomy, basic, simplistic stuff.
What is the British taxpayer willing to subsidise and what are they not willing to subsidise? For example, in the last 30 years, so across this generation, the British prison population has grown by 82%. It's nothing to do with inequality, it's just because poor people have got innately more criminal. So we're already subsidising a massive underclass. Would a policy like this be effective? Perhaps not, but would a policy that said to people when you get to 18 years of age, there would be, say, interest-free loan available to start up a small business, would a policy like that perhaps be effective in reducing wealth inequality? Perhaps. Are we willing to subsidise people's failure, or are we willing to subsidise their potential success? That is the question we have to ask, because we're already subsidising people to a massive extent. We have the biggest prison population in the whole of Western Europe by quite some distance. So it's about what we are willing to pay for and what we're not willing to pay for.
But a handout of 10 grand when you're 25?
I've just said to you, I don't necessarily think the handout of 10 grand will work because, of course, people on the right will say, poor people get nothing for no reason, and God forbid poor people get anything for no reason.
And there you have his push for essentially communism, socialism, giving people money for no reason, particularly the poor. So if you're poor, Akala thinks you should get money just because.
So how about we say money available at no interest to start a small business? This is mainstream liberal capitalism.
Giving people money for no reason with no interest isn't mainstream liberal capitalism, Akala. It's more in line with your socialist/communist utopia that you're pushing for. And because you're economically and fiscally illiterate, you don't know what you're talking about.
It stimulates entrepreneurship in the age of the internet. Why wouldn't people on the right go for such a policy?
And there we have another one from the regressive agenda. Fuck conservatives, fuck right-wingers. And this is funny because of the two left-right dichotomies or dynamics, the left side of it is known as being socially more liberal, more tolerant, and the right side of it is known for being more fiscally conservative or more fiscally sensible or more economically more prudent and sort of better with finances. And I mean, depending on who you're referencing, this is somewhat true. But Akala there is essentially accusing the right of being economically and fiscally illiterate, which of course is ironic given that the guy is pretty much socialist and pretty much a communist, pushing for communist or communistic redistributions of wealth from the wealthy to the poor.
Union per se, but from my standpoint, Brexit was not really about those technicalities. To me, Brexit was about British nationalism.
Which you think is racist.
And I think there's something quite fascinating about a country that was historically an empire.
Fuck Britain, Britain's racist.
A country that has been one of the largest sources of emigrants in the world. So, for example, we talk a lot about post-war mass migration. In the post-war years, 1.5 million British citizens took state-subsidised migration. 75% of them could not have afforded the journey without the state to Australia, to Southern Africa, to Canada, to New Zealand. Migration that was not available to those of us who came from the Caribbean. We had to pay our own way.
You're not from the Caribbean, Akala. You're not black. You have a white Scottish mother. You were born in Britain. You were raised in Britain. So spare us your noble black man race card when you're not a black man. You're a mixed race man.
As did the people from India, as did the people from Ghana. So it's fascinating that we've got all this amnesia and all this kind of aggression towards immigrants, that we would vote to leave the union based well, the second, okay, according to the Lord Ashcroft poll data, you're saying you respect democracy. According to Lord Ashcroft poll data...
Well, that's not a referendum, is it? That's
so,
a poll.
No, just a second. So according to the polling data of the people themselves who voted, immigration was cited as the second most important reason for leaving, even though
that's
it was meant...
democracy.
Just a second. Even though, as several scholars pointed out, the EU never controlled our immigration laws.
There's an appeal to authority, as several scholars have pointed out, and that's not an argument.
So if the people... you can't have it both ways, Chloe. Right? If the people themselves voted and you respect that, you've also got to respect that they said their second most important reason was immigration.
Non sequitur. The people voted in what was a legitimate democratic mandate for Brexit, the largest in British history. So you citing and referencing a poll that isn't anything to do with Brexit, isn't a legitimate democratic process or vote or mandate, is irrelevant.
And it was very...
But hang on, hang on, Akala, let's not go into why people voted as they did. What about what's happening now?
No, I've just
what
said...
about what you say you're not interested in that?
I'm not saying I'm not interested in that. You asked me about the customs union. I said I don't have a particular view on the customs union.
So, and do you have a particular view about the way it's been discussed in government? Are you confident in Theresa May's
I'm not confident
approach?
in anything Theresa May does.
Fuck Conservatives, fuck the Tories.
Oh.
My inclination is that Brexit, what it will lead to is not independence, but a closer strengthening of the quote-unquote special relationship.
Fuck America. Fuck white people are racists. That is what that is.
And an increase of the Anglo-American Empire.
Anglo-American Empire, there we go. This guy is absolutely obsessed and hung up on British history, British success, American history, American success. Now, no one is claiming that these nations have a perfect record of perfect conduct during their, if you want to call it, expansion, or during their success, but they've brought many positives, and it's a pretty legitimate argument that can be made that they are net positives globally. Stuff like the Industrial Revolution, which has essentially transformed the entire world, the commercialization of farming, which has essentially transformed the world. Africans, people in the subcontinent, India and surrounding countries, everything is raising in those countries. The life expectancy, the standard of life. More people are being fed, less people are hungry, people are earning more. But Akala, he's not interested in such facts. He won't cite them, he won't mention them. He'll mention only negative aspects of British success and American success. And although there are some negatives, and American foreign policy is rightly described as terrible, he doesn't acknowledge any of the positive contributions from these nations. Again, because he's a far left socialist / communist type who wants these nations and their traditions replaced with his socialist / communist utopia and wealth redistribution.
Notice no one seems to have an issue with the fact that we have American military bases on our soil that we didn't get a vote about. Why is that not an issue?
Because these American bases aren't actually doing any harm, Akala. That's why it's not an issue. So here's a BBC interview, breakfast, peak time interview on the major broadcaster in our country. And just watch how friendly and fawning they are over this guy. And when you contrast that with someone like, say, Tommy Robinson, Nigel Farage, anyone who is even regarded as not being on the left or the far left, just contrast their treatment with this treatment.
He's been outspoken about the Grenfell tragedy, Jeremy Corbyn, and even the entire span of human history. Is that true? Rapper and poet Akala doesn't shy away from big issues. I love the way you laugh. Let's take on human history.
When you say it like that, it sounds so magnanimous, but it's all right.
And there we go. So it's totally friendly, totally complimentary, even showing reverence to the guy, doffing the cap, very respectful, basically sycophantic.
Well, you've mapped it out in a sort of new memoir, haven't you, which talks about your life story and gives reflections on history and society. Yeah. Did it, when you started writing it, did it begin like that? Did it develop into that?
Yeah, so when I spoke to my editor, what we'd always wanted to do was use my life story to explain why I view the world the way I do.
Because you're a neo-Marxist and because you're a racist.
And then to give some historical background, because I've always had a great passion for history, as to why or how the nation came to be shaped this way and how the world came to be this way. Originally what actually happened though was all of the academic stuff, the history that's in there, was right at the beginning of the book. And it was just like, this is just too dense. And so then what we came up with was the idea of recounting particular episodes and then sort of attaching the relevant research to each episode throughout my childhood and throughout my upbringing.
Okay, so tell us, let's start right at the beginning then. How, your mum and dad?
So my mum is born in Germany, brought up in Hong Kong, comes back to the UK, meets my dad, whose both parents are from Jamaica, but he's born here in a small town called Crawley in West Sussex. So as I point out at the beginning of the book, I was born in the 1980s at the centre of the British Commonwealth, but just in my parents' meeting, there is so much history. Why was my mum born in Germany? Her dad was in the army. Why was she in Hong Kong? And so you have all of this kind of globe-spanning history. Why did English-speaking people come here from Jamaica, arriving here as British citizens from a territory ruled by Britain since 1655? So before the Act of Union with Scotland. That's how far Britain's relationship with Jamaica goes. So just in my parents' meeting, there is all that history, and that's what I tried to show.
Just at the start of your book, sort of reading it now, the attitudes then, and you talk about them quite honestly in the book, are sort of really shocking, aren't they?
Well, yes and no. I think what often happens is we look back and say, wow, look how shocking stuff was back then.
20 years or whatever.
But often we do that, and this is a consistent trope, not just with race, but with class, with so much in human history.
They're just another example of his neo-Marxist worldview, neo-Marxist framing. He's directly referenced race and class. That's at the centre of his thinking, of his worldview. Race and class, which of course is Marxism or neo-Marxism.
We say it to say, look how far we've come. But that was what people were saying in the 80s. But you know what I recount, sort of banana skins for people like John Barnes. And at the time, the John Barnes and the Cyril Regises who were outspoken, they were considered the troublemakers.
So already he's referenced the 80s, which was what, 30 years ago now, as a way of saying fuck whites, fuck Britain, Britain's racist. Now, yeah, there was racism in those days, and it was more widespread. There's always going to be racism anywhere on earth. It's funny to me how people of his political persuasion only pay attention or draw attention to instances of racism in majority white nations, never African nations, never Asian nations, only essentially white European nations. And we all know why this is. Now, I grew up in Handsworth Wood, which is barely 3 miles from the West Bromwich Albion ground. Now, Cyril Regis and the 3 degrees, as it were, the 3 prominent star black players that West Brom had in their team in the late 70s, early 80s, were pretty much adored by the West Brom fans. Yes, they did get some racial abuse, banana skins, all of that, but were they regarded as troublemakers, as you said? I don't think so. I think they were widely loved and appreciated and admired by their fans. Now, were opposing fans racist towards them in some instances? Yeah, of course they were. But the way you're painting it is they were only detested and rejected and racially smeared, when that isn't the case at all. John Barnes as well. I'm a Liverpool fan, 80s child. John Barnes was pretty much, aside from Gaza really, and Brian Robson and Lineker, Gary Lineker, John Barnes was one of the most popular, highly rated and widely loved football players from the 80s. Now this was in spite of him being black, and you're just going to ignore all of that as well and reference some instances of racism that John Barnes and Cyril Regis received in the 1980s, ignoring all their adulation or their respect from their fellow peers. I'm pretty sure both of them were Players of the Year, as voted by their fellow professionals. So the industry they're in valued them, respected them, rated them as good players.
Of course, we all look back now and we say how ridiculous that people were subject to this kind of stuff in their workplace. But at the time, they were the ones who had a chip on their shoulder for daring to speak about it. And so that's what I sort of recount, that there is much progress. There's no question that Britain is a very different country today than in the 80s. But there is also much consistency also, because that's history.
Yeah, history. And you form your current worldview based on history. And you've acknowledged that Britain has come a long way. But you still got that Britain is racist, fuck Britain, whites are racist, fuck whites, whites are racist. Because that's what this critique is. It's critique at white Western nations, not at any other nations. Which is funny to me, given that white Western nations are pretty much the best on earth. I mean, there's a few Asian exceptions, places like Japan, Singapore, other places like that have equal, sometimes higher metrics in terms of quality of life, education levels, crime levels, etc. But all things considered, like the history, the standard of living, the Western European, essentially, or Western European founded nations, so not just those in Europe, but also the United States, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, they're all the best places in the world. And it's funny to me how people like you are always based in these white Western countries, given that you think they're so racist, you're so critical of them, you think they're oppressive, you think they're brutal, you think they're all sorts of negative and horrible things, yet you remain here.
And the book is dedicated to your uncle. Yeah. Tell us a bit about him.
So my uncle Off, who doesn't know the book's dedicated to him yet, so
that's brilliant.
The launch is not till Thursday. He was kind of a giant of a man in my childhood. So he's from Guyana originally. His family essentially adopted my mum when my mum got with my dad, and so her family sort of, I won't say disowned her, but her dad particularly was very much unhappy about it, and she was kicked out of the house. So she was adopted by this Guyanese family, and my uncle Offman became both her best friend and my dad's best friend, which was particularly difficult when they split up. But when my family moved to London, he had a greater influence on my life than most parents have on their child's life. He used to mark my homework. He used to encourage me to be good at science. He used to tell me, I could work in quantum physics. I was smart enough for that. I didn't even know what quantum physics was yet. Because he was a big, strong man, you always wanted to be like him. And so he really shaped my life. He shaped how I thought it was cool to be intelligent. He became so close to the family that he would have taken custody of us if my mother had died when she got cancer, which I recount in the book.
Yeah. And
it's only now I'm an adult I appreciate how strange that is. You're a working class man, you live on a council estate in Hackney, you've got 3 kids of your own, and you've agreed to have your friends' 3 children. Like, I love my friends, but I don't know if there's any friends for whom I would take on that burden now. And so that's really why the book is dedicated to him.
We talk quite a lot on this programme about role models, particularly male role models. Do you feel very lucky that he was around then?
Yeah, of course, very, very much so. But I also think it can be a cliched term if we're not careful. It is very important to have role models. It is very important, or some people say goal models. People you can aspire to, people you can aspire to be like. But often that isn't enough, and there can be very, very real challenges. But I was very lucky to have him and many others.
Can we show our viewers a bit of your work? This is a poem of yours, The Ruins of Empire. You performed in this last month. Let's have a look.
With people no longer blinded, the truth could be seen. With a new knowledge of self, the world pursued its dream. Peace and prosperity reigned in all places. Borders were removed. There existed no nations. Governed by facts, no inferior races. Just one world with 1 million different faces. Weapons were melted down for houses to be made. Money did not exist, though people still did trade. It was right then that beautiful things were made.
And there we have it in his so-called poem. He's against borders. He's against the concept of a nation state. Now, this is a core foundation and part of the left and the far left. This is why the BBC is openly and overtly anti-Brexit. Same for The Guardian, The Independent, ITV, Channel 5, Channel 4, all left-leaning, all opposed to Brexit, because Brexit is essentially a push for a more democratic, better border maintained, sovereign nation state. These people oppose the nation state. They don't want it. You heard him. No borders, no nations. Again, this is this socialist/communist utopia that these people yearn for. It's so simplistic and childlike. If only there were no nations, no borders, everyone would get unwell, because all humans essentially are the same. They want the same things. They want everyone to be free and have money and to do what they want and speak freely. No, Akala, all humans don't want that. Take a look at the Islamic world. Take a look at Islam. Take a look at Muslims. Take a look at communist regimes. China, North Korea, Venezuela, Russia. These places don't value freedom of expression, freedom of association, freedom of speech, property rights, capitalism, secularism, humanism. Those things aren't applicable to all human beings. Your default premise assumes that all human beings, if just left alone, they'll live in peace, because essentially they have liberalist principles. All human beings don't have liberalist principles. You're deeply misguided. I'd say dangerously misguided and naive as well.
I love what you do, the kind of mixture of history, again with, is it rap, is it hip hop, or what would you describe it as?
That particular piece is a long form graphic novel that I wrote. And it's
you
a
wrote
poem.
it one day, didn't you, or something?
Well, yeah, but that's a good press story. It's not that simple. I did literally write the first draft in one day.
Right,
but I had done all the planning, and
Right,
it's actually based on an original 18th century French historical book by a man called C.F. Vonley. And so I'd done all the research and I got all the ideas together. But one morning I was in a hut in Brazil, a place called Arembepe, which is a famous hippie town, and I just started writing, and it sort of came out. But that is based on that.
Can I ask you, and many people will have seen this, because there's a music video released by Childish Gambino on Saturday Night Live last week. It's gone viral, and it was the #1 story on the BBC website when it came out as well. And it is quite graphic. It looks like a glossy music video for those who haven't seen it, and there's a bit of gun violence in there. Here's a snippet from that video. How important do you think is social commentary, and also how brutal should it be? How lifelike should it be? And what should it tell us about the society that we live in?
That's a very good question. I don't think art can be divorced from the class and race and social relationships of a given society. One of the contradictions of America, great contradictions in a way, is that even though America is probably the most unequal and brutal of all the democratic countries in the world.
Fuck America. America is racist. America is brutal. America is unequal. Now, an interesting fact that Akala and racists, anti-white racists like him, will never ever mention is the fact that if you were to take just generically blacks as a global nation, if you go country by country, blacks in America, I think, would be the richest black nation if it were a nation in itself. They have the best quality of life, the most freedom, the highest earnings. Akala doesn't acknowledge this fact. So black Americans are better off than blacks in Africa, the Caribbean, any indigenous black nation or any indigenous black country or population are worse off than black Americans. So majority blacks in black nations with black leaders, essentially black societies, are worse off than black Americans who, according to Akala, suffer brutality and repression and oppression under what he deems as a white supremacist system. So again, his narrative doesn't align with reality, doesn't align with the facts. And he never mentions these facts because, of course, they debunk his entire worldview, which is fucking nonsense. Now, I'd love to debate Akala. He's probably more educated than me, but he's not smarter than me. He's not more informed than me, generally speaking. He knows his history, I'll give him that. He can reference and pull out dates, which I probably can't. But in terms of overall understanding, I'd say I have a better understanding. And I'm not the smartest guy in the world. I went to a bog standard, comprehensive, bog standard upbringing, working class upbringing, bog standard schooling pretty much, from infants to juniors through to senior school, college, etc. I'm not a massively academic or highly educated in terms of academic education individual, whereas Akala is more academically educated than I am. But I'm pretty confident in a debate with him or anyone of his ilk that I'd come out on top. Of course, this will never happen because I'm just a nobody. But even if I was put on Akala's radar, he wouldn't take me up because I'm the wrong colour. I'm way too dark to be producing such thoughts and such arguments and such opinions. And a key component of Akala's arsenal is the race card. And he wants to pull the righteous black man race card, essentially towards the opponents he has. And he target, the aim of his arguments and positions are all anti-white positions. So he wants to use his noble black man race card in his argument or towards his opponents, essentially white people. He can't play that card with me. One, because if he wants to play the blackness card, I'm actually more black than him. I'm 3/4 black, he's half black. I regard myself as mixed race, but I am actually majority black. So I could quite rightly, quite technically regard myself as black. I have more of a typically black appearance than Akala does, for example. Genetically, I'm more black than Akala. My melanin level, more black than Akala. Now again, I don't care about all this shit. He's a mixed race individual. I regard myself as a mixed race individual. But if he wants to play the blackness card, then I can play that and I can outdo him in that, given that I'm more genetically black than he is. And as I said, he isn't black. He's not a black man. he's mixed race.
It also has produced this really strong artistic tradition of really virulent critique of the American government, of its injustices, much more than, say, even here in popular culture. And so I think that's actually one of the positive aspects of American society and culture, that you see this particularly in hip hop, but before that in jazz, before that in blues or Rage Against the Machine and others.
He's begrudgingly referenced a positive aspect of American culture, American society, but he's framed that entirely within blackness, if you like. So he's attributed this positive aspect of American culture into hip hop, into jazz, which are black produced or black centered art forms or forms of music, or at least forms of music that came out of black areas or came from predominantly black people. Now, music, as with any art, it isn't white, it isn't black, it isn't Asian. It's just music and art. And everything is borrowed and stolen and mixed with other forms, other genres. And this is a case for hip hop, this is a case for jazz.
And I think the line is not a definite one. You know, when have you crossed the line into being distasteful, into kind of sanitizing violence by making it so glossy? I don't know. But I think it's better to have the art exist and critique it than to say, oh, that's gone too far.
Yeah, the fact we're having the discussion is
It's
probably
better
a positive thing. Isn't it?
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's so fascinating talking to you. We are running out of time. I'm very sorry about that.
No worries.
Because I'd love you to stay here. But Akala's book is called Natives, Race and Class in the Ruins of Empire. And it's out on Thursday.
It is.
Thank you.
And thank you for telling your uncle that it's dedicated to him live on this
Yeah,
program.
no,
I
it's
hope
all
you've
good.
been watching.
Yeah, no, I hope so.
Oh,
Great to
excellent.
talk to you.
Oh, Akala, aren't you wonderful? Aren't you so enlightened and educated and wise? Essentially there, what you saw is a free plug, an advertisement for his book. Now, BBC doesn't have adverts. It's one of the good things about it, but of course this is because it's taxpayer funded, which of course is a terrible thing. Now, I don't give them a penny. I don't watch the BBC. It's garbage. It's a far left activist, social justice warrior corporation, and I don't give them money to put out their bullshit. And I'd advise all of you to do the same and not give them a penny. So they don't have adverts, but with people they like, such as Akala, when it's things they support, such as neo-Marxist propaganda, they're willing to have them come on and promote their product free of charge, of course.